So my interest in the Burning of Cork began many, many years ago when I discovered a series of old postcards relating to that tumultuous event in Cork City itself. These were initially published by the Manchester Guardian newspaper, and they were later republished by the Cork printers Guy and Company. The interesting thing about the Burning of Cork is that the only contemporary account that exists are either eyewitness reports that were in the press, or else we have the seminal Irish Labour Party report of January 1921, and they recorded a 70 eyewitness account at the time. It appears that history kind of waned as regards the subject and in the burning of the city, and no books were actually published at the time. And it's only in later years that interest kind of came back again as regards what actually happened. We had the successful rebuilding of the city with its new modern architecture, and the tragic events then of the Civil War, and that nearly bankrupted Ireland both morally and financially, and this all led to a kind of a collective amnesia about what happened at the time. I suppose people were kind of embarrassed, they were ashamed to say that their city had actually been burned by the British forces. We're looking at a map here. It's a map of Cork City, and it's prior to 1920. And it just gives a slight overview of how the city looked at the time. We're looking, for instance, there in the centre of the map there, Great George's Street. In 1918, Great George's Street became Washington Street because we had a nationalist corporation in place who were busy at the time renaming some of the streets. Just look at the city itself and see what was actually happening in the city. Why were people unhappy with British rule? So in the period 1859 to 1919, only 700 houses, or 12 houses per year, had been built by the local authority. This resulted in the growth of tenements, where the poor rented rooms in large old houses which had been vacated by Cork's elite classes. 719 tenements were the homes of 2,928 families, which consisted of 3,772 males and 4,903 females, totaling 8,673 persons, or 1/9 of the entire population of the city. It's very hard to actually fathom that. Society at the time was marked by a huge degree of inequality between the richest and the poorest. The opulent 1% owned 70% of the total wealth of the country. We'll just have a look here at this particular image, and it's a view of one of the lanes in Cork in the north side, and you can literally see the poverty. It screams out at you. You see how the houses are so near each other. You can see the children in their bare feet, and you can see kind of an emaciated dog there in the background. So this is what we were looking at in the likes of tenements, what was actually happening in the city at the time. Looking at Patrick Street, we're looking at motor cars, which were becoming a very familiar sight on Patrick Street. And the reason I'm looking at Patrick Street now is you can see the buildings here to the immediate right, and these are the ones that were destroyed during the burning of the city itself. So it's just to look at this and get an idea of the architecture. And we just look at some more views now. Again, we see Henry Ford had built his first factory in Cork in 1917, setting, I suppose, Ireland and Cork on the road to industry, which he claimed at the time. I look at some of the actual businesses that existed, and here we have James Mangan, and fortunately the pillar clock still exists in Patrick Street. This is the scene outside Mangan's, number 34 Patrick Street, and the recruiting office at that time in 1914 was at number 2. So you can see here the British Army were in full control of the city. Union Jacks here we see from many premises, as numerous proprietors had their allegiance to Britain. Interesting there to see on the left on that tram the London House, which was one of the premises consumed by fire. Then as now, the main thoroughfare was St. Patrick's Street, and many early street directories and old newspapers record that many premises on the street had long trading traditions. The famous clockmaker's Mangan's, which we had seen earlier, was established in 1817. John Arnott had a store here in 1842, which later became Grant's department store. The Munster Arcade opened in 1866. Carmichael's, later Cash's, 1868. Egan's Silversmiths, 1870. And Fitzgerald's Menswear had been on the street since 1860. Thus, many of the famous department stores had been firmly established by loyalist proprietors, thus explaining the Union Jacks displayed outside their premises. Here we have a scene here, and you can see to the actual right of it here, you'll see Cash's ornate iron lampposts, which were destroyed during the conflagration. Trams and hackneys vie for trade on Patrick Street, and we notice here the wide expanse of Patrick Street. The trams existed actually from 1898 up to 1931. This is a wonderful view here, and it shows the actual shop fronts again, and it's nice to get a nice view of how they actually looked prior to the destruction. You have the Munster Arcade, you have Sunner's Chemist in the centre, which, funnily enough, in many of the scenes later, you'll see the gable of that, and it stands out as a landmark, and it actually shows us where it was located. It was one of the few parts that existed. And then you have Egan's next door. William Roach and James Keating set up the Cork Furniture Store in Merchant Street in circa 1910. By June 1919, William Roach was the sole proprietor, and he purchased the London house, which stretched his finances to the limit. In September of that year, the shop was legally changed to Roach's Stores. And here we have a view of how he started. He started in Merchant Street, and here we have an image here of the Cork Furniture Stores. This is Roach's Stores, when it became Roach's Stores Limited in September 1920. And we can see here he was selling clothing, underwear, boys' clothing, but he also done furniture. He encapsulated every form of fashion. This is a kind of prophetic view, actually, insofar as we see the London house here to the right, and we see these Edwardian ladies passing by. And if you look carefully at the horse and cart coming, that's actually 3 firemen there. So I suppose little did they realise that some years after that they'd actually be trying to save that particular shop. Now we're looking here at the Republican side of Cork, which is very interesting, because there was a huge series of events leading up. It just didn't happen. So we have a rare view here of the building of the National Monument, which was under construction in 1903. And you have 2 major contrasts in this view. To the left, you have RIC officers on horseback, and they are awaiting the arrival of King Edward VII, who was going to view the Cork exhibition at that time. Here we have an image of Thomas McCurtain, and he was Cork's first Republican Lord Mayor. At that time, we had 3 Republican Lord Mayors. So the first Republican Lord Mayor, Thomas McCurtain, he was elected on the 31st of January 1920. He was murdered in front of his wife and children on March 1920 on his 36th birthday. And here we have the funeral procession on Camden Quay, and to the left there you'll see the old Opera House. And you can see throngs of people came out in support of the Republican movement at that time. The murder resulted in the historic inquest conducted by Coroner James McCabe. The findings were that the Lord Mayor was murdered by the RIC, officially directed by the British government. The inquest recorded a verdict of willful murder against David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of England, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and the command chain of the RIC. This resulted in the assassination of Detective Inspector Oswald Swansea in Lisburn on Sunday, the 22nd August 1920. Here we have a Republican image of Terence MacSweeney. And following McCurtain's murder, Terence MacSweeney was unanimously elected Lord Mayor in his place. On the 12th of August 1920, Terence MacSweeney was arrested as a considerable British Army contingent of 6 armoured cars and lorries raided the City Hall. He was charged and convicted of illegally possessing a cipher enabling the decoding of military dispatches. Terence MacSweeney died at Brixton Prison on October 25th, 1920, on his 74th day on hunger strike. You can see the funeral procession itself, and it's lining Patrick Street. There was a massive outpouring of grief and media attention on this event. It even resulted, at the time, King George wanted to grant him an actual pardon, but the British government refused. We now come to Cork's 3rd Republican Lord Mayor. So Donald O'Callaghan becomes Lord Mayor on the 4th of November 1920, but unfortunately for him, he spent his time mostly on the run. Together with Peter MacSweeney, Terence MacSweeney's brother, they became stowaways on board the ship, the West Cannon, and they went to give evidence to the Independent American Commission on Conditions in Ireland. Unfortunately for O'Callaghan, he has become Cork's forgotten Lord Mayor. He was never really in the limelight, and his anti-treaty position consigned him to history. We'll now look at the British forces at the time, and we're going to look here at the Black and Tans. So the Black and Tans, officially the Royal Irish Constabulary, which meant they were policemen, Special Reserve. They consisted of temporary constables recruited to assist the RIC. The nickname Black and Tans came from the colours of the improvised uniforms that they wore. They had a kind of mismatch of uniforms, maybe an RIC tunic, khaki pants, or vice versa. Then we have the Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary, the ADRIC, generally known as the Auxiliaries or Auxies. This was a paramilitary unit of the Royal Irish Constabulary set up in July 1920 and comprising mainly of former British officers. The auxiliaries also became infamous for their reprisals on civilians, and the burning of houses, shops and creameries was one of their main weapons of terror. K Company, this is a very important company. K Company was formed by Brigadier General F.P. Crozier on the 22nd of November and consisted of 3 platoons made up of other auxiliary companies. And here we have an image of the notorious K Company in November 1920. And these were the people, you're actually looking at the people here that were responsible for the burning of Cork City. You can see a group of auxiliaries here at Glanmire Railway Station, and you can see again here that they're wearing assorted uniforms. If you look there to the immediate left, this man would have been an airman, you can see by his goggles and his leather cap. Another man is wearing a trench coat, and another one is wearing, we say, a beret there to the right. This is a scene of armoured cars going over Patrick's Bridge. It just conveys some idea of what was happening. Cork was not a normal city at that stage. This is an interesting photograph because it shows an RIC roundup of men to be searched probably for weapons, and during these searches people were often robbed and intimidated. And another thing to look at in this view is you have a picture of 27, the Munster Arcade, and above that you have Brooks Hughes, the photographer. So not alone were the premises down on the first floor had problems, it was also the people that lived in the second stories, the dressmakers, the dentists, the photographers. their businesses were also burned, and it's very important to note that these are actually the forgotten people. And here we have, I put this image in here, it's an image of Brooke Hughes, and you can see he was 14 years chief artist with Guy & Company, and this just shows some of his work and his studio, which was destroyed during the burning of the city. Now, things were really starting to hot up at this stage. General Tom Barry was the commander at Kilmichael. So the Kilmichael ambush of the 28th of November resulted in the killing of 16 auxiliaries at the ambush site itself. This ambush was to have severe ramifications for Cork, as on the following nights, several premises in the city centre were set on fire. The Irish Transport and General Workers Union building on Camden Quay was set on fire and destroyed on the night of the 29th. The City Hall was attacked on the 30th once more, but fortunately survived. And here we have an image of the American Shoe Company, and that had just about survived the November arson attack. Just have a quick look at the dates of fires, because the burning of the city didn't just happen immediately. There was a big lead up, and there was a lot of other smaller fires in the city prior, we say, to the main event. On October the 9th, City Hall was set on fire, and the fire brigade was called, and at 5:30 it had confined to 2 offices. On November the 21st, Dwyer's on Washington Street was set on fire at 12:25 a.m. On November the 24th, houses and shops in the Shandon Street area was set fire at 3 a.m. On November the 24th, Hardwick Street Pipers Club, that was burned out at 11:50, and that also housed the Sinn Féin offices. November the 25th, the Grand Parade, a private house bombed and burned at 3 a.m. And of course, again, there was a Sinn Féin office located within this premises. On November the 27th, McGurk's North Main Street was alight at 2 a.m. On November the 27th again, forests were set on fire on Patrick Street, and at 4 a.m. the firemen were fired on by the military. November the 28th, Blackthorn House, Patrick Street, and others were destroyed at 1:50 a.m. November the 29th, as we had already said, the Transport Union Workers' Hall was set on fire. It was extinguished. It was set on fire again at 3 a.m. The firemen were fired on, and at 7 a.m. they were called again. The first call that was received at 2 a.m. But they could actually do nothing because they were fired at and they were sent from the fire. On November the 30th, Thomas Ash Club in Charlotte Quay, now Father Matthew Quay, that was blown up and that was set on fire at 1:15 a.m. On November the 30th, City Hall, again, bombed and fired. That was extinguished. And at 3:40 again, it was set on fire. And at 5 a.m., it was set on fire and extinguished again. On November the 30th, Mrs. Egan's Patrick Street was set on fire at 5:05 a.m. and that was extinguished. December the 1st, O'Gorman's and Dalton's and McCurtain Street were bombed and set on fire, and they were burned out by 5 a.m. December the 2nd, shops and rooms at Marlborough Street were on fire at 1 a.m. December the 10th, North Main Street at Timberyard was set on fire at 4:10 a.m. And we're just looking here at one of the images of Ryan's, and why was Ryan's set on fire? The reason was that Ryan's were Republican, and they had Irish-made umbrellas, costumes, brooches, and they wanted people to buy the products basically of Ireland at the time and to keep the workers working. Here we have an image of the burned out premises of Forrest and Sons in November. This is at the corner of Cook Street. This is the premises of the Irish Transport and General Workers' Hall on Camden Quay, which were destroyed. And as you can see, either side, both houses were destroyed as well. Here we have an image of the City Hall, the old City Hall. And what you have here is you can actually see an armoured car and a soldier. He's possibly lighting up a cigarette, which is kind of a bit prophetic, and you look at what's actually happened. You can also note the hoarding on the windows, and this tells us that this hoarding was put up to prevent incendiary bombs, etc., being fired in their attempts to set fire to the City Hall. Here we have a picture of the actual belfry, the clock itself, and you can see the hands have been blown off. Basically, there's 3 bullet holes to the left-hand side of that there, and when the blackened hands and auxiliaries used to take pot shots at it. We're coming now to the Dillon's Cross ambush itself, and we're looking to see what the papers reported at the time. So the Cork Examiner at the time reported that somewhere between 7:30 and 7:40 on Saturday evening, the inhabitants of the district were greatly startled by first an exceedingly loud explosion, and then 2 or 3 others in rapid succession and not quite so loud. When the dense clouds caused by the smoke and falling splinters had disappeared, it was discovered that at least a dozen auxiliaries were wounded, including Auxiliary Spencer Chapman, who subsequently died. The auxiliary policemen were coming from the direction of the military barracks. Sometime after 8 o'clock, a series of burnings began at Dillon's Cross, and these were practically continuous until day dawned. And here we have an army tank, and that's used to demolish the remains of Brian Dillon's house. And of course, this was another particular target, because Brian Dillon, a famous Fenian, had a plaque on that particular building, and again, it was seen as a preferable target, because again, anything Republican was to be eliminated. It's thought that while searching the site of the ambush, that the auxiliaries had found a cap belonging to one of the volunteers and had used bloodhounds to follow the scent, which unfortunately led them to the Delaney home in Dublin Hill. Their father, Daniel Delaney, gave this account to the Irish Labour Party Commission, and he says that about 2 a.m. a number of men came to my door and demanded admission in a loud voice. Then at least 8 men went upstairs. I heard distinctly 2 or more shots, and my 2 boys fell immediately. My brother-in-law, William Delaney, who was sleeping in the same room, was fired on and wounded in 2 places. Jeremiah and Con Delaney did not die immediately. Several days later, on December the 18th, Cornelius finally succumbed to his wounds, and he died in the Mercy Hospital. Here we have an image here of auxiliaries and how their tactic of using bloodhounds, and this is what happened on that particular night. There were 2 people that were murdered in their beds. Here we have an image of Jeremiah Delaney, and there's Cornelius Delaney. While the British government's reaction was to be expected, the attempt to shift the blame for the burning onto the Republican movement by the Bishop of Cork received widespread condemnation from citizens and the members of Cork Corporation at the time. Bishop Collin insisted that anyone who organised or took part in an ambush or in kidnapping or otherwise shall be guilty of murder or attempt at murder, and by that fact shall incur the censure of excommunication. So here we have a picture of Bishop Collin, whose decree of excommunication caused consternation, especially among Republican forces. And here, this picture is actually taken outside Brixton Prison when Terence McSweeney was on hunger strike. Here we have a map showing the areas that were actually destroyed, and the areas in black here show the main buildings. You can see there to the right City Hall as well outside that area. The Dillon's Cross ambush was not the direct catalyst for destroying the commercial heart of the city. Premeditated plans were in place to carry out this task well in advance of the ambush. It only served to expedite the devastation which was to befall Cork City. Many high-class department stores were targeted, looted and destroyed in the process. For days the ruins had to be hosed down due to the intense heat generated. And here we can see all the smoke and flames, and this image was taken a few days after the burning itself. This is the only nighttime photograph of the fire itself. It was taken, as you can see, from some distance away. And this is what was actually happening in the city. This is a pre-1920 Christmas advertisement, and it's for the firm of William Egan and Sons. And you can see they were located there at 32 Patrick Street, and they were looking forward to a good Christmas, obviously, selling platinum bar-fronted brooches and gold quality bracelets. And here we have the New York House and Wolf's premises. They would never reopen, because some of the premises that were destroyed, they actually never reopened again. Here's, if you look at the previous picture now, you'll see this was New York House, and again, they were looking forward to a bumper Christmas. They were selling a lot of stuff actually for the smoker, fine cigars, cigarettes, pipe racks, tobacco jars, pouches, and they all went up in flames, obviously. Even the tram system wasn't free to travel at the time. What you had was, this is the remains of a tram where people were told to get off the tram on that particular night, and the tram was actually set on fire by the auxiliaries in black and tans. And if you look to the left there, you'll see Mangans, and you'll see hoarding on where the plate glass would have been. This is where Mangans was actually, the glass was broken, the premises was raided and badly looted. But fortunately, Mangans was one of the few premises that survived. The reason that premises survived was because the manager and his wife were living overhead, and they managed to get out successfully. This is from Cook Street. The opposite side of the street, obviously, escaped destruction. I think the worst thing that happened on the opposite side was the smoke, and the flames were so intense that the paint blistered on many of the premises on the opposite side of the street. Here again we have an image of the actual devastation, and you can see here some of the impact, and people out trying to clear way on the streets. They're sweeping the streets. You'll see some of the buildings there quite precariously, just the gable fronts are just about standing and ready to fall, because there are numerous reports of buildings collapsing into the street with some very, very lucky results. Here, this one here, and what's interesting about this image, this particular image was commissioned by Edward Grace, and he was the manager of Henry Ford's in Cork, and Henry Ford had given him instructions to get a photographer to take images of the city, because he was very worried that something was going to happen to his factory on the marina. Here we have toilers, and it's nice to show some of the advertisements at the time to give you a flavour, I suppose, of the fashion, what was happening. And again, these people were looking forward to a good Christmas, selling their footwear. And again, what you'll see here is number 20 Winthrop Street was the actual branch that was destroyed. This is the devastation on Robert Street, and that's showing the rear of the Munster Arcade premises. And we see here, after many attempts, the Crown Forces, they finally gutted the City Hall. And you can see all is left of the City Hall in this image is the actual facade itself. It's recorded at about 4 a.m. in the morning that the belfry tower fell right down into the centre of the building, and it made its final sounds, that time the crashing of the belfry into the rubble below. Firemen, of course, had been stationed at the City Hall, and they gave their eyewitness account. They had observed petrol tins being carried into the building, and that was followed by a loud series of explosions. About 30 policemen, a head constable, and 3 sergeants continually turned off the hydrant, preventing the firemen from extinguishing the fire at the City Hall. Here we have an image of the Carnegie Library, which was adjacent to the City Hall, which was also destroyed. All the books, manuscripts, and everything that existed within that library, none of them survived. The only things that survived, only books, were ones that were out on loan at the time. That's the librarian in there, James Wilkinson. Now we look at Captain Alfred Hudson. Alfred Hudson was Cork's fire superintendent from 1891 to 1928. Hudson made his mark, and many letters praising the brigade for prompt attendance at fires are recorded. However, no amount of pre-planning could have prepared the Cork Fire Brigade for what they faced that evening. Lord Mayor O'Callaghan sent out a call for assistance in the hope that reinforcements would prevent the spread of fires. Now what we have here is, they actually came. This is the antiquated fire engine to the left of the Cork City Fire Brigade, and that's alongside the Dublin fire engine. Captain Myers had come down on a special train from Dublin with this new fire engine to help put out the fires in the city. This is what Alfred Hudson had to say at the time. I have no hesitation in stating I believe all the above fires were incendiary fires, and that a considerable amount of petrol or some such inflammable liquid was used in all of them. In some cases, explosives were also used, and persons were seen going into and coming out of the structures after breaking an entrance into same. And here we have an image of Captain Myers of the Dublin Fire Brigade, and he praised the Cork Fire Brigade for the work they had done. He actually said that when he arrived in the sea of darkness, and when he came into the blazing city, he didn't think that it could be saved at all, that the whole city was gone. Here we have an image of General Strickland. He was the commander of Cork Barracks. He initiated the Strickland inquiry into the burning, which took place on December the 16th at Victoria Barracks. The main purpose of this inquiry seems to have been to clear the military of wrongdoing, which not surprisingly it did. On the 4th of February 1921, Prime Minister Lloyd George said of the report, "If it is published, it is an unpleasant document." Churchill stated it would complicate things and give ammunition to the enemy. This inquiry was suppressed for 78 years, but it points the blame firmly at the auxiliaries and the RIC. This is another event. This happened after the excommunication decree was issued, and this is an image of the Cork Examiner printing press, which was destroyed by Republicans on Christmas Eve. They were very, very unhappy that the Examiner had printed and published the excommunication notice in their paper, and as a result, this is what they had done. We're just looking here now at some of the temporary inquiry huts that were established, and the ones that we're looking at here are, we can see here, the Munster Arcade and Egan's. And a lot of people would kind of say, why were these put into position? One of the reasons was these people had to maintain the claim on the land, and this was their area. This is where their shop had once stood. And it was very important for them to put up temporary structures as a result, because nothing was actually left. You can see here, there was actually nothing in the Munster Arcade, there's nothing of Egan's, and you can see right into the back from Cash's was the same, and the side streets. There's the temporary structure of William Egan and Sons. We have here Cudmore's on the corner, and to the right, Burton's, and they had a temporary premises at number 2 Patrick Street. And here we had one of the advertisements at the time, and this is announcing their temporary premises at number 2 Patrick Street, where business is being carried out as usual. Here we have an image of the Munster Arcade and another temporary premises, but what they have done is they actually installed the clock. It looks quite like their original premises. You can see the Hackney drivers again, and they're trading outside the premises, getting people to take fares through and from the city. Another temporary premises here you can see is Cash and Company, and to the right of that you can see the Lee Cinema, and that was only open a few weeks, and that had been set on fire and destroyed. The facade there, you can see that's the only part that remained of the cinema itself. Here we have a map of the proposed rebuilding lines. With the burning of the city, the Cork Corporation at the time decided to take some advantage of the fact, and they decided that they would kind of realign some parts of the city itself. This is a drawing here of Chillingworth and Levy's Rocha stores, because Rocha store at this stage didn't exist, there was nothing there, and William Roche decided he'd buy up some of the surrounding land, and he was then going to build his vision of a modern department store. Cork Corporation had suggested changes to the layout of the streetscape that would seriously complicate the process of rebuilding. Closing streets such as Robert Street and widening others raised serious objections by traders. People were entitled to compensation where building lines sustained loss by either the setting back or moving forward of the premises. And we can see this when Cashes conceded the widening of Mailer Street by 3 feet and Caroline Street by 10 inches, and they were recompensed accordingly. Here we have an image here of Murphy Brothers, who were the main building contractors for the building of Rocha stores. William Roche gives us again a first-hand account of what was actually happening within the company. He says this was a very difficult time for the company as we had no experience dealing with builders, architects, quantity surveyors, etc. on such a vast scale. William Roche had acquired several premises adjoining London House, which were amalgamated into his new vision of a department store. It took 6 years until the time of the burnings, until the building was completed at the enormous cost then of £26,474, 16 shillings, right down to the 10 pence. And here we have an image of Rocha stores. And for a long time, Rocha stores had a wonderful image, a wonderful sign outside their building. And one of the reasons that was so ornate was to take people's mind off the fact that above Rocha stores itself on the next story was actual government offices. The tax offices were located on the first floor. Here we have an image of the city centre itself completed. And then this was taken kind of shortly after the completion of the city itself, but not, as you see in the background here, the city hall is only kind of half built, half of the city hall is only in existence. But you can see the wonderful limestone facades of the buildings. And what happened as a result of the rebuilding was the local trades got involved, the trade unions got involved, and they insisted that local labour and local limestone were used. For instance, Burton's at the time wanted to use Norwegian granite, but that wasn't going to happen. The trades came out and they had to settle for Little Island limestone, local limestone. Here we have an image of the last building, I suppose, really, that was built, and this was built by Cork Builders Siskin Company. The compensation at the time was supposed to be 78,000, but when the building was finished, it cost far in excess of that. I said the last building to be completed was Cork City Hall. Philip Monaghan had become Cork's first local authority manager. He diverted the compensation award to build houses for the working classes. True to his word, the first of many housing schemes comprised of 50 houses in Fairhill, and these were completed in 1927. I suppose in conclusion, the burning of the city, it had thrown 2,000 people out of work. It made many, many people homeless. It was a long time before the compensation was paid out until the Anglo-Irish Treaty Agreement. 1923, we had a civil war. So we can see the last building to be completed was 1927 on Patrick Street itself. It was a tumultuous time in Cork's history, but like a phoenix from the ashes, I think Cork, it raised itself up. We have some wonderful new buildings today, not least of all, as I said already, the City Hall itself, a beautiful, beautiful building. And many of these buildings were built by Cork workers, using Cork material. and certainly the burning of Cork has left its mark on the city. But when we look at these fine buildings, we can take some solace that the city had regained a lot of its former commercial prosperity, etc.